Hello again, and welcome back to History 1152. In this video, we will be considering American foreign policy in the late 19th and early 20th century, and how the United States became a true world power. We will examine major events and people who helped make this change possible. Before we talk about America as a world power, we need to talk about America as an empire. Americans today usually do not like to refer to their country as an empire. They associate the word empire with the world powers of the past, Britain, France, even Rome. It seems like a backward term. It should not apply to a modern nation-state like the US. The term empire also evokes images of violence and oppression, something that we do not like to associate with the United States. However, Americans in the past were less uncomfortable thinking of the United States as an empire. The Founding Fathers, including Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, thought of the United States as an empire of liberty that would spread the ideals of freedom across the world. As we know, the United States did not always live up to the ideals of freedom that the founders promised. But the empire of liberty idea was also popular in the late 19th and early 20th century. Let's talk about what an empire is. Experts agree that an empire is an extensive, organized group of states, countries, provinces, with different groups of people, ruled by a single government which seeks to inculcate a common culture amongst its disparate peoples. By this definition, then, the United States was an empire from the beginning, as it encompassed 13 states that contained a variety of people, united into a single country. Over time, the states became integrated into the federal union, strengthening the growth of the American state. America did not have a king or an emperor, which differentiated the U.S. from the European empires of the Founding Fathers and later generations wanted to challenge. Proportionally speaking, Americans had the right to vote at a much higher rate than the people of the Old World empires, although the United States did not have universal suffrage for all of its citizens. So, I want you to not be afraid of thinking of the United States as an empire, and keep in mind that empire is not necessarily a dirty word. The Founding Fathers did not think it was a bad thing to refer to the United States as an empire, and turn-of-the-century Americans did not think imperialism was a bad thing either. In this video, we will explore what American foreign policy and imperialism looked like in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. We will start by going back to 1890. As you remember, 1890 was an important year in U.S. history. It saw the Wounded Knee Massacre, the last battle between the U.S. military and a Native American nation. It was also the year that many demographers and policymakers stated that the United States no longer had a frontier, because at least two people were living on every square mile of the nation's territory. In 1893, Frederick Jackson Turner developed the frontier thesis, arguing that westward expansion and struggles with Native Americans, Mexicans, and Canadians along the borders of U.S. hegemony made America vital, democratic, and powerful. With Native Americans and Mexicans defeated and a static border established with Canada, the U.S. had no room to expand in North America and needed to grow overseas and establish new frontiers if the nation was to remain strong and free, according to Turner's supporters. The U.S. had already purchased Alaska in 1867 for $7.2 million. Some Americans thought the territory was useless, calling the purchase Seward's Folly, after William H. Seward, who once served as Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State and was the deal's American negotiator. The indigenous people of Alaska were not compensated during the transfer. Seward was an avid imperialist who wanted to expand American territorial reach. He, and others like him, thought that controlling Alaska would lead to the eventual annexation of some or all of Canada. While Canadian annexation did not happen, Alaska provided a very lucrative fur trade to American investors. The discovery of gold in Nome in 1898 only made the purchase better for the United States. Between the fur trade and gold rush of 1898, Alaska more than paid for itself. Although the states' indigenous inhabitants were not compensated. Alaska would not become a full state until 1959. Ultimately, Alaska was purchased peacefully and with little controversy despite the nicknames Americans gave the acquisition. The American annexation of Hawaii would be more controversial. The first confirmed European visit to the Hawaiian Islands occurred in 1778 during the voyages of British captain James Cook, who was killed by the archipelago's inhabitants. Some think the Spanish may have visited the islands sooner. After the Europeans' discovery of Hawaii, European sailors and whalers began using the island archipelago as a stopover on their voyages across the Pacific Ocean. In 1795, King Kamehameha I united all the islands of the archipelago under a single monarchy. His dynasty would rule until 1872. In 1819, American missionaries arrived on the islands and converted many of the Hawaiians to Christianity. The missionaries and their followers enacted blue laws that ended many traditional practices of the Hawaiian culture, including polytheism, ritual cannibalism, gambling, boxing, and surfing, although some of these activities would be permitted later. The missionaries and their descendants fostered close relationships with the Hawaiian monarchy and established a parliament to help the monarch rule. The descendants of the missionaries also established pineapple and sugar plantations and brought in foreign laborers, mainly Chinese people, to work the plantations alongside indigenous workers. The Hawaiian monarchy began to break down in the 1870s, due to at least one of their monarchs failing to produce an heir. Into this power vacuum, the mostly white Hawaiian parliament sought to increase its power over the islands, passing property requirements for voting in 1887. This legislation essentially disenfranchised most of the island chain's non-white inhabitants. These laws were called the Bayonet Constitution because the Hawaiian monarch, Kalakaua, signed the document under threat of violence. In 1893, Queen Liliuokalani attempted to pass a new constitution that would make her Hawaii's absolute monarch and dissolve the parliament's power. In response to Liliuokalani's attempt to change the Hawaiian government structure, a group of mostly British and American businessmen led a coup d'etat that removed her from power and sought annexation from the U.S. The U.S. minister to Hawaii called for a company of Marines to maintain order on the island and to prevent the Queen from retaking control. Many Americans opposed the actions of the coup conspirators and the role that U.S. citizens played in the overthrow of Liliuokalani. They regarded the Americans' role in the coup as illegal. This did not stop U.S. President William McKinley, an avid expansionist and annexationist within Hawaii, from annexing the independent Republic of Hawaii in 1898. Hawaii would not become a state until 1959, the same year Alaska gained statehood. In 1993, President Bill Clinton issued an apology resolution to the indigenous people of Hawaii, noting the United States' role in the coup against Liliuokalani, and that Hawaii had been made a territory of the U.S. without a plebiscite of the Hawaiian people. Alaska and Hawaii became a part of the United States, first as territories before becoming states, and the United States still holds 5 inhabited overseas territories. But for this lecture, we'll discuss the territory of Puerto Rico next. The United States gained Puerto Rico during the Spanish-American War, which grew out of Cuba and the Philippines' attempts to gain independence from Spain. Cuba began its War of Independence in 1895, and the U.S. remained out of the conflict, although many Americans sympathized with the Cubans, identifying their independence struggle with the American Revolution. The U.S. did not enter the war until 1898, after the sinking of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor. The Maine had been sent to Havana to pressure Spain into negotiating with the Cuban revolutionaries, an episode of what is often called gunboat diplomacy. After the explosion of the Maine, which killed 250 sailors, President McKinley and most American politicians urged caution, but everyday Americans believed Spain had deliberately sunk the vessel, calling for intervention in Cuba and war against the Spanish Empire. American newspapers, especially those owned by William Randolph Hearst, printed inflammatory articles about the Maine to turn the public against Spain. This partisan, sensational, and often dishonest news reporting is called yellow journalism. American politicians soon saw the war as an opportunity to strengthen the masculinity of American males, believing that war against Spain would strengthen American males through military service in the same way that the Civil War and the wars against Indians on the frontier had supposedly done. American policymakers also saw the war as a chance for reconciliation between white Southerners and Northerners, uniting them against a foreign enemy. U.S. troops landed in Santiago de Cuba and quickly defeated Spanish forces. Future President Theodore Roosevelt led the 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry Regiment as part of the American assault on the Spanish at San Juan Hill, but his unit sustained heavy casualties as it attacked the Spanish left flank and had to be reinforced by troops from the U.S. 24th and 25th Colored Black Regiments of the Regular Army. The U.S. Army also made effective use of Gatling guns, primitive, crank-fed machine guns to shield their advance. In the popular memory, however, San Juan Hill is remembered as part of Teddy Roosevelt's splendid little war against Spain. The United States, a young, vital, upstart empire, made strong by a bloody civil war and decades of intermittent fighting with Indians, used its volunteer citizen soldiers to defeat the old, weak, and corrupt Spanish Empire, whose rule in the Americas was finally coming to an end. This popular narrative about the war misrepresents the tactics and technology the U.S. military used to defeat the Spanish on San Juan Hill, and, in a much larger pattern, minimized the effectiveness of the regular army by making volunteers the hero of the battle. The popular narrative also tends to leave out that many of the regulars who fought at San Juan were people of color. While the United States helped to make Cuba an independent nation, it did not do the same for Puerto Rico. The United States had gained control of the island after invading it in 1898 and defeating the Spanish garrison at Guanica. Puerto Rico was ruled by a military government until 1900 and remains a territory to this day. Why is Puerto Rico still a territory? Why did it not become a state like Alaska or Hawaii? Puerto Rico, in 2020, has over 3 million inhabitants, over twice as many people as Hawaii, and 4 times as many people as Alaska, yet it has remained a territory for over a century. There are many reasons for this, and there are people in both Puerto Rico and the U.S. who oppose the island's statehood, just as there are people who advocate for it. One of the reasons Puerto Rico remained a territory, as opposed to becoming a state or gaining its independence, came because of taxes. American businessmen and tycoons wanted to sell consumer goods in Puerto Rico and export raw materials, namely sugar, out of the island, essentially treating the island like an American colony. If Puerto Rico became a U.S. state, or if it became independent, they would have to pay American taxes or foreign tariffs to both Puerto Rico and the U.S. For business interests, Puerto Rico's territorial status was the best of both worlds, as it allowed American capitalists access to an international market without foreign or domestic taxes. Many Puerto Ricans initially opposed statehood as well because they ultimately wanted independence and self-determination, the right to self-governance. Many of the Puerto Rican elite also opposed statehood because it would decrease their own power, even if their citizens would gain increased representation within the U.S. government. Many white Americans opposed Puerto Rican statehood for racist reasons, because they were concerned that Puerto Rican citizens would alter the racial demographics of the country. This was an argument made by anti-imperialists, including William Jennings Bryan, who was an important populist, progressive-era politician. Bryan took part in the war, but only because he supported Cuban independence, not American imperialism. Ultimately, the debate over Puerto Rico and its position within the United States is still an issue today. While the debate over what to do with Puerto Rico remains contentious in the present, how to handle the Philippines, which the U.S. also required during the Spanish-American War, was far more volatile in the early 1900s than Puerto Rico was. What made the Philippines different than Puerto Rico? While Puerto Rico was one large island, the Philippines are a massive archipelago, spread out over hundreds of square miles, and the Filipinos are a diverse, multi-ethnic people who were already engaged in a war of independence against Spain long before the U.S. intervention, although the U.S. Navy had secretly been aiding the Filipino revolutionaries. The Filipinos initially welcomed the U.S. Army as liberators and allies against Spain, as they had been unable to gain independence on their own. The U.S. Navy defeated a Spanish flotilla in Manila Bay, allowing the Army to capture Manila, the capital, on August 13, 1899, although they were unaware that the U.S. and Spain had already signed a peace treaty. The U.S. military's capture of Manila was accomplished largely without the collaboration of indigenous forces, and the Filipinos, who had established the First Filipino Republic, soon realized the U.S. intended to rule the archipelago in place of Spain, denying them their independence. To Filipinos, the U.S.-Philippines War was a continuation of the War of Independence against Spain, but for the U.S., it was an insurrection that had to be put down. Many Americans believed that the Philippines must be ruled by the United States until it had become stronger economically and had developed an American political system. Otherwise, it might be taken over by a European empire, like Great Britain, or a rising Asian power, like Japan. The Filipinos who fought the United States did so for a variety of reasons. Some simply wanted to end foreign rule, like the military leader Emilio Algonado, and others were true revolutionaries who wanted to fundamentally transform Filipino society, which had a rigid caste system, hoping to make the nation more democratic. Some Filipinos also supported the United States. The Filipino insurgents, who did not have the weapons and materiel necessary to defeat the United States using conventional warfare, instead created an insurgency that used guerrilla and hit-and-run tactics to lower American military morale, with the hope that the American public would grow tired of the war, and an anti-imperialist like William Jennings Bryan, who ran for president in 1900, would pull all troops out of the archipelago. Ultimately, the war became increasingly brutal, and the U.S. military adopted irregular warfare tactics to create an effective counterinsurgency. Atrocities, especially the torturing of prisoners, were committed by both sides. The U.S. military often targeted Filipino civilians, destroying their farms and homes to prevent them from giving aid to the revolutionary insurgents. Some scholars think that American military strategists used the same kind of tactics in the Philippines that the U.S. military had employed against Native Americans, to starve the Filipinos into surrendering if they could not defeat them in combat. Some of the violence was racially motivated, but the U.S. Army also exploited ethnic divisions within Philippine society and made alliances with Filipinos who did not support the revolutionaries, just as the U.S. Army exploited tribal disputes between Native Americans during the Indian Wars. Ultimately, most of the fighting had died down by 1902, although some ethnic groups continued to fight the U.S. occupation until 1913. Some Americans, like the famous author and anti-imperialist Mark Twain, opposed the war, believing that the occupation was undemocratic and made the U.S. no better than Spain. Some anti-imperialists opposed American rule of the Philippines for racist reasons, believing occupation and annexation might lead to Filipinos migrating to the U.S. mainland. Ultimately, the Philippines would be made a commonwealth of the United States and would gain independence in 1946, after World War II. The United States' involvement in the Spanish-American War, and then in the subsequent annexation of Puerto Rico and the Philippines, along with its interventions in other countries, were defined by contemporary American beliefs about politics, culture, and race. American politicians, especially President Theodore Roosevelt, the hero of San Juan Hill, believed that the American empire must replace the old European empires. Spain, Great Britain, France, and Russia. Roosevelt believed the United States should intervene decisively in foreign disputes, using big stick diplomacy in order to make the world, in contemporary parlance, safe for democracy. This can be seen in Roosevelt's negotiations between Russia and Japan after the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 through 1905. Roosevelt developed the Treaty of Portsmouth, which attempted to balance Russian and Japanese expansionist interests to bring peace to the region. For his efforts, Roosevelt won a Nobel Peace Prize, although many people in Japan were angry with the treaty, because their country had won every military engagement of the war, and they thought the treaty did not do enough to penalize Russia. Roosevelt was a part of the progressive movement, and he applied many progressive-era beliefs about the use of government power and professional experience to fix international problems. Roosevelt also built upon the established Monroe Doctrine, a policy created by President James Monroe in 1823, which held that the U.S. had the right to keep European countries from interfering in the Latin American independence movements that were occurring at the time. Roosevelt added to the Monroe Doctrine, arguing that the U.S. had the responsibility to act as a mediator between European powers and the nations of the Western Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine was reactive, whereas the Roosevelt Corollary was proactive. It was intended to legitimize the United States' growing role as the world police. Often, though, the U.S. would act in its own interests under the guise of promising to mediate conflicts and spread democracy. This could be seen in the establishment of the Panama Canal. The United States helped Panama gain its independence from Colombia in 1903, so the canal could be built to connect the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean, which the U.S. would then control. Throughout the early 20th century, the United States intervened in Cuba, Nicaragua, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic, using the Roosevelt Corollary as justification. American policymakers wanted to prevent instability in these countries, but their decision to intervene was often informed by contemporary ideas about race, and the belief that non-white nations could not immediately govern themselves. It would need protection from the United States. Otherwise, these states would collapse or be taken over by the old European empires. Fitting with the contemporary idea of white man's burden, that people of Northern European descent must protect non-Europeans, who were innately childlike and had to be trained to govern themselves. This same thinking also impacted the annexation of the Philippines as well, although the Roosevelt Corollary was more focused on the Americas. The United States was less concerned with its own citizens trying to take over countries in the Americas, however. The Cayamel Fruit Company, which owned extensive banana plantations in Honduras, hired a mercenary army to overthrow the Honduran government, ostensibly for colluding with a competitor, the United Fruit Company, in 1912. The U.S. government did not try to prevent the coup, because the Honduran government was unable to pay its foreign debts, even though the coup ultimately weakened the Honduran economy, turning an already struggling nation into an unstable banana republic. The U.S. government also intervened in internal conflicts within the countries of the Western Hemisphere. During the Mexican Revolution of 1910 through 1920, the United States, under President Woodrow Wilson, sent Marines to Veracruz in 1914 because the German Empire was supplying weapons to the dictator Victoriano Huerta. This intervention took place on the backdrop of increasing tensions between Germany and the other European empires, namely France and Russia, on the eve of World War I. Wilson tried to have U.S. troops remove Huerta's dictatorship, ostensibly to back the constitutionalist faction of Venustiano Carranza, but most Mexican political factions, even those who benefited from the intervention, opposed Wilson's actions, which they viewed as a threat to Mexican national sovereignty. The intervention caused Carranza's coalition of revolutionaries to break apart. One of his former allies, Pancho Villa, attacked the town of Columbus, New Mexico, burning it to the ground. on March 9, 1916, allegedly because the U.S. had sold him defective weapons. Villa made several other incursions into U.S. territory. In response to this attack, President Wilson sent 5,000 troops under General John Pershing, a veteran of the Indian Wars, and the U.S.-Philippines conflict, to invade northern Mexico later that month. They searched for Villa until January of 1917, but failed to apprehend him. While the U.S. Army failed to capture Villa, the expedition did give American troops some critical combat experience on the eve of the American entrance into World War I. The United States did not join the First World War until 1917. Democratic President Woodrow Wilson, who was president during the U.S. interventions in Mexico in 1914 and 1916 through 17, campaigned for re-election in 1916 on the promise to keep America out of the conflict, which had degenerated into slow and brutal trench warfare on the Western Front. Wilson had cast the U.S. as a neutral arbiter, a referee that remained above the scrimmage of war that had been created by the corrupt old European empires. In truth, though, the U.S. was never neutral and favored the Entente powers, Britain, France, and Russia, from 1914 on. The U.S. sold far more supplies to Britain and France than it did to Germany, leading Germany to target vessels carrying materiel from the U.S. to Europe. Germany made use of technological improvements to submarines to effectively harass Entente shipping in the Atlantic. On May 7, 1915, Germany sank the RMS Lusitania, a British passenger liner. Over 1,000 passengers died because of the sinking, mostly from hypothermia, just like the passengers of the Titanic in 1912. The Lusitania was carrying U.S. citizens, and 139 of them died in the sinking. The Germans justified the attack, arguing that the Lusitania was carrying munitions and that Americans should have known better to travel aboard a vessel loaded with war material, since they had been warned about the ship's cargo by German diplomats. The attack, and Germany's justification of it, angered many Americans, and Germany scaled back its unrestricted submarine warfare in the Atlantic in response. Nonetheless, Americans remained angry with Germany, and anti-German sentiment, which had been common in the 19th century, greatly increased from 1915 on. German policymakers handled the Lusitania incident poorly, but their mistakes were minor compared to the Zimmermann telegram. What was the Zimmermann telegram? The Zimmermann telegram was a coded telegraph communication between the German Foreign Office and the Mexican government in 1917, during General John Pershing's punitive invasion of Mexico. German diplomat Arthur Zimmermann, the author of the cable, declared that Germany would restart its unrestricted submarine warfare, and that if the United States declared war on Germany, Germany would give Mexico financial and material assistance if Mexico declared war on the U.S. Most poignantly, Germany promised to return Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona to Mexico in exchange for their assistance against the U.S. Germany had previously tried to provoke a war between the U.S. and Mexico, and they had backed the Huerta dictatorship during the Mexican Revolution with the intention of keeping the U.S. preoccupied with Mexico and out of the war. President Venustiano Carranza of Mexico and his military advisors evaluated the telegram and its offers and determined they were unrealistic. They did not think that Germany could provide any meaningful assistance to Mexico, much less win the ongoing Great War. They also thought the retaking of the Southwest would be impossible as well, believing that the Anglo-American citizenry was too well armed and would never peacefully accept Mexican hegemony. They also worried that the U.S. military power was too great, and that a conflict in 1917 would end badly for Mexico, like the U.S.-Mexican War of 1846 through 1848. Ultimately, the telegram was a long shot and poorly received in Mexico. It also alarmed many Americans, who were anxious about the instability of their southern neighbor. While the Zimmermann telegram moved Americans closer to war, the biggest factor that led to the U.S. entrance into the First World War was Germany's resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare in the Atlantic. Americans who had previously opposed U.S. intervention in Europe, even as they had stood by while their country intervened throughout the Americas, were soon calling for war in Europe. President Wilson, a progressive, also saw U.S. intervention in the war as a chance to make the world safe for democracy, while also weakening the old world empires. Wilson promised peace without victory in Europe, and self-determination for peoples living under the hegemony of the European powers, making the world more peaceful and democratic. Wilson saw war and the mobilization of the American economy and military as an opportunity to bring progressive policies into effect in the U.S. as well. Long-standing policies would have to change to get the nation ready for war. Throughout the 19th century, the U.S. government had kept its regular army small and underfunded, because maintaining a large professional military was expensive, and Americans historically had been suspicious of regular soldiers, preferring instead to lionize volunteer citizen soldiers and militiamen. In 1917, the regular army numbered less than 150,000 effective troops, and the National Guard, which bore remnants of the old militia tradition, had less than 180,000 soldiers, most of whom were deployed on the U.S.-Mexican border. To make up for this massive lack of manpower, Congress passed the Selective Service Act, which legalized conscription of male citizens for military service. Americans historically had hated drafts and had rioted against conscription during the Civil War. By the summer of 1918, over 24 million American males between the ages of 18 and 45 had been registered for the draft. The U.S. government also made Puerto Ricans U.S. citizens so that they could be drafted as well. Men who were married with children or worked in careers deemed essential to the war effort were exempt from the draft. Many American males were rejected for service because they had physical disabilities, were illiterate, or were deemed mentally unfit. In the end, over 6.4 American men were drafted, 4.8 million served in the Army, but less than 3 million saw active duty. The U.S. government also ran massive propaganda campaigns to entice American men to volunteer or accept the draft. The famous "I Want You" poster featuring Uncle Sam aggressively pointing at the viewer, which was a copy of a similar British print, appealed to Americans' sense of patriotism and loyalty to the country, as personified by Uncle Sam, who represented the American nation. American artists, commissioned by the U.S. government, created posters featuring attractive women who needed protection from a foreign enemy, appealing to the patriarchal desires of American males and contemporary gender roles. They also created posters to inspire civilians to buy war bonds, grow victory gardens to provide food to the troops, and to recycle trash that could be turned into war material. The artists also created prints to inspire young women to volunteer as nurses, and to motivate mothers to teach their children to save money for the war effort. Artists also sought to galvanize the American people, including naturalized immigrants and first-generation Americans, into helping the war effort. Conversely, propagandists created images that cast the Germans as violent, bloodthirsty monsters, Huns, or as mindless martinets that committed atrocities against civilians, dehumanizing them and casting them as the racial other, in order to arouse American ire against Germany. This had the unintended side effect of increasing anti-German sentiment in the United States, with many German Americans being attacked for their heritage. Despite cases of anti-German violence, the U.S. government's propaganda campaigns overall galvanized the American people to fight against Germany. The war also gave progressive politicians an opportunity to enact other policies that would have been impossible without the war. The 18th Amendment, which effectively banned the sale of alcoholic beverages, likely would not have passed had it not been for the raw material shortages brought on by the war. The 19th Amendment, which extended voting rights to women, might not have passed in 1920 after the war ended, had the First World War not brought so many women into the workforce outside of the home. African Americans also tried to use the war to advocate for their civil rights. African American men joined the Army, although most did not see combat, being kept in supporting roles. There were exceptions, like the 369th New York Regiment, who were commanded by the French Army. The 369th took part in the Second Battle of the Marne and earned the nickname the Harlem Hellfighters because of their bravery and resolve. The French Army was not segregated in the same way the U.S. Army was, and black soldiers enjoyed the freedom they experienced while in Europe and longed for the same back in America. They were fighting to spread freedom abroad, even as many of their people were being denied freedom at home. The addition of American troops provided the Entente with the manpower they needed to begin pushing the German lines back. The addition of American soldiers, nicknamed doughboys, or Sammies, by their European comrades, provided a morale boost to the British and French troops, whose morale had been flagging. Although the Americans did not have as much combat experience as their allies, they fought hard and played a decisive role at battles such as the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, in which Sergeant Alvin C. York, a conscript from Tennessee, captured a machine gun nest all by himself after all of his squad mates had been wounded. York killed at least 6 Germans, and after he had captured the machine gun emplacement, over 100 Germans surrendered to him. For his actions, Sergeant York received the Congressional Medal of Honor and was depicted as a hero and an American everyman. Ultimately, over 53,000 Americans died fighting in the First World War, with over 60 million casualties overall. The First World War was a culmination of years of work on the part of American policymakers to transform America into a world power and overseas empire. The nation had gained holdings in Hawaii, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and across the Pacific and Caribbean. The U.S. had also established a motivation for its foreign policy, to police the world and make it safe for democracy, even if the nation and its actors did not always live up to this goal, both abroad and at home. In the end, though, the United States emerged from the First World War and its previous armed interventions as militarily strong and with a generally unified purpose, even if further U.S. interventions would be questioned in later years. But that is a subject for another video.